The Tessran conclave called its central structure the Spire of Settled Things, but no one who had ever stood beneath its black glass dome believed the name described mercy. It was a courthouse, with a killing floor at its heart, a place where the Tessran had refined 10,000 years of grievance into a single, elegant ritual, where contract disputes and territorial claims and matters of bloodline honor were not argued before scribes, but resolved on a disk of fused obsidian 40 meters wide, beneath light that fell from above like a verdict already written. The disk was warm to the touch, even when the chamber was cold. The Tessran said it remembered every duel it had drunk. Visitors from 40 systems came to watch the resolution rites the way other species watched executions, with the particular hush of people who knew that what they were seeing was both legal and lethal, and that the law had been built specifically to make the second part inevitable. The conclave did not call them deaths. It called them settlements, and it had never, in the recorded history of the Spire, settled a matter in favor of a creature that arrived holding the wrong weapon. Into this chamber, on the 14th day of the trade season, walked a maintenance contractor named Ellery Vane, who had been summoned to answer a charge he did not fully understand, and who carried, in his right hand, a spoon. He was not a large man. He stood a full head shorter than the smallest Tessran in the gallery, with the kind of unremarkable build that came from 20 years of crawling through ductwork and bracing himself in cramped service shafts, and a face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild, patient attention, as though the entire proceeding were a stuck valve he had been called in to look at. He did not look frightened. He looked like a man who had read the appliance manual and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. The Tessran arbiter, who had filed the challenge against him, was a tall, plated creature named Drushok Vile, and Drushok had built an entire career on never once being wrong in this chamber. The Tessran were a species shaped by their own history of scarcity. On their homeworld, where the seasons swung between drought and flood with no warning, survival had gone to those who could hold a position, and over the eons that biological truth had hardened into a culture that worshipped the held edge, the firm grip, the blade that did not waver. Their hands were their pride. Each Tessran possessed 4 long fingers and a thumb that opposed with surgical strength, and along the inner surface of those fingers ran rows of micro-serrations, biological teeth that let them grip a hilt with a force no human palm could match. A Tessran duelist could not be disarmed. The blade was, in a real and physiological sense, an extension of the arm, and the resolution rite had been designed around exactly this advantage, so that the contest was never truly about who was right, but about who could not be made to let go. The serrations were not merely strong, they were locking. Once a Tessran closed a grip with intent, the microteeth interlaced with the texture of whatever they held, and held it through a tendon mechanism that ratcheted tighter under load, so that struggle against the grip only deepened it, the way a knot pulls itself smaller the harder it is yanked. A Tessran youngling learned to grip before it learned to walk. A Tessran elder, dying, was buried with its hands still closed around the haft of a ceremonial blade, because to be found with an open hand was, in the oldest dialect of the conclave, the same word as to be found a coward. The grip was not a skill they possessed. It was the thing they understood themselves to be. Drushok Vile had won 41 settlements. He had let go of nothing in his life that he had not chosen to release, and he had selected Ellery Vane as his 42nd opponent with the same cold deliberation he applied to everything, because Ellery Vane had seen something he was not supposed to see, and the spire of settled things was the most respectable murder weapon in the conclave. The charge against Ellery was a fabrication, and Drushock had fabricated it with care. 3 weeks earlier, Ellery's repair contract had taken him into the substructure beneath the spire itself, into the cooling galleries where the obsidian disk shed its stored heat into a lattice of conduits that ran down into the planet's mantle. He had been sent to fix a thermal regulator that kept tripping. A small job, a half-day job. What he had found instead was a second set of conduits, unlisted on any schematic he had been given, siphoning a slow, steady flow of refined, heavy isotope out of the conclave's reactor stores and into a private holding cell, registered to no public account. He had noticed it the way he noticed everything, by the wrongness of a small number. The thermal regulator kept tripping because the heat load on its sink was 11% higher than the schematic allowed for, and 11% was not a rounding error. It was a second customer, drawing off the same line, and a man did not spend 20 years tracing the difference between what a system was supposed to do and what it actually did without learning that an unexplained 11% always had a name attached to it somewhere. He had followed the line. The conduits ran clean and new and well machined behind a false bulkhead that someone had keyed to a maintenance code 3 revisions out of date. The kind of oversight that came from a thief who understood reactors and did not understand janitors. He had not understood the politics of it. He had understood the engineering of it perfectly. Someone was stealing reactor fuel at a rate that would, within 2 seasons, leave the conclave's own emergency systems dangerously thin, and the theft had been routed through the one structure no inspector would ever think to audit, because the spire was sacred, and the sacred was not searched. Ellery had filed a routine maintenance note flagging the undocumented conduits. He had done it because that was what the manual said to do. Within 4 days, Drushock Vale, who chaired the conclave's resource committee and who had built the private holding cell with isotope sufficient to fund a war he intended to start, had filed a formal grievance accusing the human contractor of sabotage and had invoked his right to settlement. Ellery had not known any of this when the summons arrived. He knew it now, in fragments, having spent the intervening days doing what he always did with a problem he did not understand, which was to take it apart and look at the pieces. He had read the conclave's public legal archive, all of it, every settlement on record, in the flat machine translation his terminal could manage. He had learned that the right had exactly one rule that mattered. The challenged party chose the weapon, not the challenger. The challenged, it was an ancient courtesy, a relic from a time when the Tesseract had wanted their duels to seem fair, and in 10,000 years it had never once helped anyone, because every challenged party, faced with a Tesseract whose grip could not be broken, had chosen a blade, and had lost because they were choosing to fight a Tesseract at the one thing a Tesseract could never lose. Ellery read that rule 11 times. Then he went to the commissary on the 3rd level of his lodging block, and he took a spoon. The gallery of the spire held 400 Tesseract that day, arranged in tiers of cut stone that rose into the dark beneath the dome, and when the humans stepped onto the warm obsidian disk and the proctors saw what he carried, a sound moved through the chamber that the oldest attendants present had never heard in that room. It was not laughter. The Tesseract did not laugh at settlements. The right was holy, and mockery within it was itself a punishable offense. It was something stranger, a low collective intake the sound of 400 predators all recalculating at once and arriving at the same conclusion, which was that the creature on the disc had lost his mind, and that the settlement would be brief, and that they had wasted an afternoon. Drushak Vial, standing at the challenger's mark with the settlement blade as long as the human was tall, felt the first genuine emotion he had allowed himself in years, and it was relief. He had worried, briefly, that the human's maintenance note might surface in some committee before the settlement could be concluded. Now he understood that he had overestimated the creature entirely. The thing could not even arm itself correctly. He would settle the matter. The body would be removed. The note would be reclassified as the sabotage of a clearly unstable contractor, and the conduits would keep flowing. The proctor, a thin elder Tesran, whose duty was to confirm the weapons, approached the human and stared at the implement in his hand for a long moment. The object was a standard commissary spoon, formed from a single piece of cheap-pressed alloy, its bowl shallow and slightly bent, its handle worn smooth. The proctor asked, in the formal cadence of the rite, whether the challenged party confirmed his chosen instrument. Ellery turned the spoon over once, examined the bowl, and confirmed it. The proctor asked whether he understood that the rite did not pause for surrender once the disc was warm. Ellery said that he did. The proctor withdrew, and for 3 excruciating seconds, absolute silence reigned in the spire of settled things. Then, Drushak moved. He moved the way the Tesseran had moved for 10,000 years, with a controlled lunging step that brought the full reach of the blade across the center of the disc in a single committed line. A movement bred into the marrow of his species, the strike that ended settlements before they began. It was beautiful. It was also, Ellery had calculated, entirely predictable, because a creature whose entire identity rested on never letting go was a creature who could not stop emotion once it had committed to it. Ellery did not try to block the blade. He did not try to dodge the line of it. He stepped inside it, into the one place a long weapon could not reach, the place where the Tesseran's reach became his prison, and as Drushak's arm extended past him, he brought the bowl of the spoon up against the inner joint of the arbiter's wrist, against the soft, articulated membrane where the great gripping fingers met the forearm, and he pressed. He did not strike. He pressed with the patient, exact pressure of a man who had spent 2 decades finding the single point on a seized mechanism where force did the most work, and he held it there, while Drushak's own forward momentum drove the joint against the rim of the spoon's bowl with all the weight of the lunge behind it. Something in the wrist gave, not broke, gave. The micro serrations along Drushak's fingers, the biological teeth that could not be made to release a hilt, depended on a single tendon bundle that ran across that exact joint, and the bundle, compressed between the human's bent spoon and the arbiter's own committed weight, did the one thing 10,000 years of Tesseran pride had insisted it could never do. It let go. The settlement blade rang against the obsidian disc and lay still. For a moment that stretched far longer than the second it occupied, Drushak Vial stood on the warm black glass with his hand open, staring at fingers that would not close, and the 400 Tesseran in the gallery stared with him, and no one in the spire of settled things made a sound at all. The arena went silent. Up in the 3rd tier, a young proctor in training named Sevak Lateran felt the entire architecture of her understanding shift in the space of a breath. She had been raised, as every Tesseran was raised, on the certainty of the grip. The grip was the thing. The grip was what they were. And she had just watched a soft-handed alien with a bent piece of kitchen alloy reach into the most sacred contest her people possessed and switch off the grip like a man tripping a breaker. She did not think the human was strong. She thought something far more unsettling. She thought he had read them, not the arbiter, not the blade, but the species, the whole 10,000-year architecture of who they believed themselves to be, and had found in it the single load-bearing assumption and pressed his thumb against it. The grip cannot be broken, so the grip is everything, so build everything around the grip. He had not argued with that. He had agreed with it completely, and then he had stepped into the one place the logic left undefended, the moment of commitment, when the unbreakable grip became an unbreakable mistake. Sevak had spent her whole life believing the held edge was the strongest thing a person could be. She watched the human stand on the warm black disk with his open soft hand and his bent spoon, and she understood in a way she had no words for yet that there was a strength in the thing that let go on purpose, and that her people had been calling it cowardice for 10,000 years because they had never once seen it used well. The rite did not end with a disarming. Tessran law held that a settlement concluded only when one party yielded the disc, and Drushak Vile, whatever else he was, had not built 41 victories by yielding. He recovered the blade in his off-hand, his serrated fingers clamping the hilt with the desperate force of a creature reasserting the one truth it had left, and he came again. Faster now, with the line shortened and the lunge abandoned, all short-controlled cuts meant to give the human nothing to step inside. Ellery gave ground. He gave it the way a man backs along a narrow service shaft, never hurried, always measuring, his eyes not on the blade, but on the joint of the wrist that drove it, and the gallery, which had expected the human's trick to be a single lucky accident, watched him refuse to be cornered for a span of nearly 2 minutes, an eternity on the disc, while Drushak's strikes grew fractionally wilder with each one that found only air. The human did not move like a fighter. He moved like a man stepping back from a pressure leak, weight always over his heels, never committed, never reaching, and twice when the blade came close enough to part the fabric at his shoulder, he did not flinch, but simply noted the line of it and adjusted, the way a technician notes the swing of a load and steps clear of it. Drushak had fought soldiers and arbiters, and once a war-bred carnivore from a gravity well that would have crushed a Tessran flat. And all of them had done one of two things, attacked or fled. And both of those things he knew how to answer. The human did neither. He read. Every cut Drushak threw. The human filed away, the timing of it, the recovery, the half-instant where the locked grip meant the arbiter could not change a committed line, and Drushak felt, for the first time in the chamber, that had made him the specific cold of being studied by something that was not afraid of him and was simply waiting to understand him completely. The narrator of any honest account would note here that Ellery Vane was not winning. He was surviving, which against a Tessran arbiter was its own kind of impossible, but the disc was 40 meters wide and not 40,000, and a creature that could not be disarmed twice in a row did not need to be disarmed twice in a row. It needed only to land once. And then the chamber changed, not because of anything the human did, but because of what the spire itself did. The obsidian disc, which the Tessran said remembered every duel it had drunk, began to warm beyond its usual heat. It was not part of the rite. Sevak Lateran, whose training included the thermal liturgy of the spire, felt it through the soles of her feet before the proctors below understood it. A rising heat that pulsed up from the cooling galleries beneath, and she knew with sudden cold clarity what it meant because she had read the same maintenance archive The human had read, in the course of her studies, and had thought nothing of it. The undocumented conduits beneath the disk were not merely siphoning isotope. They were drawing the disk's stored heat away from its proper sink and into Druschak's private holding cell, and the cell, packed now with isotope far beyond its rated capacity, had begun to feed that heat back. The spire of settled things was sitting on top of a thermal cascade that its own sacred status had hidden from every inspector for 2 seasons, and the duel had been scheduled by Druschak to conclude long before the cascade reached the disk. The duel had not concluded. Druschak had not accounted for a creature that would not lose quickly. The first conduit ruptured beneath the eastern rim of the disk, with a sound like the world clearing its throat, and a section of the gallery floor 3 tiers up cracked and tilted, and the 400 spectators who had come to watch a settlement found themselves in the space of a heartbeat inside an emergency none of them had the framework to understand. They were a species of duelists. They knew how to hold a line and how to win a contest of grips. They did not know how to read a heat-stressed structure because in 10,000 years the spire had never failed, and the sacred did not fail. Ellery Vane stopped backing away. He stood still on the warming disk, and for the first time, the patient, mild attention on his face sharpened into something else. The focus of a man who has finally been handed the actual problem under all the other problems, and he turned away from Druschak entirely, which no challenged party had done in the history of the right. And he looked at the cracked and tilting tier where a knot of tesseran were trapped against a buckling wall, and among them, pinned by a fallen slab of cut stone, was Sivak Litterin. The proctor in training had been thrown from the 3rd tier when the floor cracked. She had landed against the failing wall, and a section of facing stone had come down across her lower body, and she could not move it because tesseran's strength was in the grip and not in the back, and the slab was wrong. The angle was wrong. The leverage was all in the stone's favor. She watched the human cross the disk toward her through the rising heat, and she did the arithmetic of her own people's instincts, which told her that the alien was coming to finish what the duel had started, to claim the disk by removing the only witness who understood what he had done. She was wrong about that. Ellery reached the slab and did not look at her face. He looked at the slab the way he had looked at the spoon, at the disk, at the conduits 3 weeks ago with the flat assessing patience of a man cataloging forces, and he found what he was looking for in under a second, a hairline fracture in the slab itself, a stress line where the stone had taken the impact and not yet finished failing. The heat off the disk was bad now, bad enough that he had to plant his boots carefully where the obsidian had not gone soft, and the air carried the flat mineral stink of stone heated past its temper. And somewhere below them, a conduit was ringing under pressure with a high, thin note like a struck wire. None of it changed the way he worked. He set the bent spoon into the fracture. He had not dropped it. Through the entire duel, through the disarming and the retreat and the cascade, he had not once let go of the spoon. And the tesseran, who later reconstructed the settlement, would find this the single most incomprehensible detail of the entire event: that the creature whose advantage was his ability to release had never released the one tool he held. He set the spoon into the fracture, and he braced his boot against the disc, and he turned it. And the principle was the same principle as the wrist, the same principle as every seized valve and frozen coupling he had freed in 20 years, that a small force applied at the exact point of weakness did the work of a force 10 times its size applied anywhere else. The slab split along the fracture line. It did not lift. he had no leverage to lift it. It split, and the half-pinning Sivak's leg slid free along the new fault, and she pulled herself out from under it and lay on the heaving floor, staring at the human who had already turned away from her toward the next problem. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not say anything to her at all. He had already moved to the buckling wall where 4 more Tesserae were trapped, and he was reading it, finding its fracture, setting the spoon. Sevak Lateran lay on the cracking floor of the spire of settled things and understood that she had been wrong about everything, and that the wrongness went all the way down. Drushak Val stood alone at the center of the warming disk with his settlement blade in his unbreakable grip, and no one left to settle anything with. The gallery was no longer watching the duel. The gallery was watching the human pull Tesserae out of the wreckage of the most sacred structure in the conclave, one impossible fracture at a time, and Drushak understood, with the cold internal clarity that had served him so well and now served him not at all, that the settlement was over, that he had not lost it, that something far worse had happened, which was that everyone in the chamber had stopped thinking about the duel and started thinking about the heat, and that the moment they finished thinking about the heat, they would think about where it came from. The conduits were his. The holding cell was his. The cascade that was tearing the spire apart had his name on every unlisted schematic, and the only being in the chamber who had already traced those schematics was the soft-handed contractor currently saving the lives of the witnesses who would convict him. Drushak did the arithmetic and arrived, at last, at the correct answer, which was that he should have let the maintenance note stand and never invoked the right at all, because the right had brought the human here, to this disk, at the exact moment the cascade reached it, and had given him 3 uninterrupted minutes to be looked at by 400 Tesserae who would remember, for the rest of their lives, exactly who had been standing across from him. The cooling galleries beneath the disk were failing in sequence now, and the heat was no longer a discomfort but a danger, and the proctors, recovering their training, had begun to organize an evacuation of the upper tiers. It was here that Ellery Vane did the thing that the chamber would talk about for a generation, longer even than the spoon. He climbed down off the disk into the maintenance access he had used 3 weeks earlier, the hatch that opened into the cooling galleries, and he went down into the heat alone, because he was the only being in the spire who knew the layout of the conduits that were killing it. Sivak Lateran, dragging herself upright on a leg that would not bear weight, watched the hatch close behind him and made a decision that no proctor in training had the authority to make. She followed him down. Below the disk, in the red dark of the cooling galleries, the human was already working. The space was a lattice of conduit and strut, barely tall enough for a Tesserae to crouch in, and the air shimmered with heat that came off the walls in waves. And Ellery Vane moved through it with the unhurried economy of a man in a place he understood, his hand reading the conduits the way another being might read a map. Sevak crouched behind him, useless and unwilling to leave, and watched him find the master coupling, where the undocumented conduits joined the legitimate cooling system, the single point Drushak's engineers had installed to route the stolen heat. It was a beautiful piece of work, she would think later, a clean and elegant theft. And it had exactly one flaw, which was that it had been built by Tesserae, who built everything around the assumption that a coupling, once gripped and locked, stayed locked. The locking ring required a grip of a specific torque to release, a torque calibrated to Tesserae's strength, deliberately set beyond the casual force any inspector might apply, so that the coupling would read as fused and permanent to anyone who tried it the ordinary way. Ellery looked at it for a moment. He read the whole assembly the way he read everything: the flow direction, the seat of the ring, the place where the design had assumed a force and therefore failed to defend against its opposite. A Tesseran engineer building to release under a grip had set the release notch on the outer face of the ring where a gripping hand would fall, and had never imagined a hand that would not grip at all, but would instead reach past the notch to the rim and pry. Then he braced the bowl of the spoon against the ring's release notch, set his whole weight along the handle, and used the strut behind him as a fulcrum, and the locking ring, which had been designed to resist a grip, turned under a lever it had never been designed to resist at all. The undocumented conduits sealed. The stolen heat stopped flowing into the holding cell, and the cell stopped feeding the cascade, and the rising temperature in the galleries crested, held, and began, slowly, to fall. He had not stopped the damage already done. He had stopped it from getting worse, which in a failing structure was the entire difference between an accident and a catastrophe. And he had done it with a kitchen spoon and a strut, and the one truth about Tesseran engineering that the Tesseran themselves had been too proud to see: that a culture which built everything around the grip had built everything to be defeated by the lever. Sivak Lateran crouched in the cooling red dark and watched a soft-handed alien save 400 of her people with the same bent implement he had used to humiliate her finest arbiter, and she understood that the two acts were not different acts. They were the same act. They had always been the same act. The human did not have two skills, one for fighting and one for fixing. He had one skill, the patient reading of where a small force would do the most work, and he applied it without distinction to a wrist, a slab, a coupling, a life. It had simply never occurred to her people that the thing that ended a duel and the thing that saved a structure could be the same thing, because they had spent 10,000 years believing that strength and care were opposite directions, and the human had just demonstrated, without saying a single word about it, that they were the same direction, seen from different ends. They climbed back up into the chamber together, the human and the proctor in training, and the spire of settled things had stopped dying. The disk was still warm, warmer than it should have been, but the killing heat was bleeding off into its proper sink now, and the 400 Tesseran in the cracked and tilting gallery were alive, and they were all, every one of them, looking at the maintenance contractor who had come to answer a charge of sabotage and had instead prevented the destruction of their most sacred place, using the evidence of the actual sabotage. The investigation took 11 days. It did not require Ellery Vane to give a speech, which was fortunate, because he would not have given one. It required only the conduits, which were where he had said they were, in the maintenance note he had filed 3 weeks before any of this began, the note Drushok Vale had tried to bury under a charge of settlement. The committee that convened to read the wreckage was not, at first, willing to believe what the wreckage told them, because the alternative to believing the human was believing that an arbiter of the conclave had turned the spire of settled things into the machinery of a private theft. And that was a thing the Tesseran had no comfortable place to put. So they checked it the way a wounded pride checks a thing it does not want to be true, slowly, and twice, and from every angle that might let them out of it. The conduits did not let them out of it. The conclave's resource committee, which Drushok had chaired, traced the undocumented flow back through the private holding cell to the accounts that had funded its construction, and the accounts told the rest of the story without any human assistance at all. They found the false bulkhead and the out-of-date maintenance key. They found the locking coupling in the cooling galleries with its release notch freshly scored by something narrow and bent. They found, when they finally cross-read the human's original note against the schematics Druschok had certified as complete, that the contractor had described the theft in flat technical language 4 days before the grievance was filed, and that the timing of the grievance, set against the timing of the note, formed a line as clean and committed and impossible to recover from as any lunge Druschok had ever thrown on the disc. Druschok Val had not invoked the right to defend his honor. He had invoked it to settle a witness, and the right, the ancient sacred mechanism he had trusted to do his killing for him, had instead held him on a warm black disc in front of 400 of his peers for exactly as long as it took for his own theft to tear the chamber apart around him. The Tesseract did not have a word for that kind of justice. They began, after the settlement of Druschok Vale, to develop one. Ellery Vane returned to his maintenance contract. The conclave offered him a great many things, honors and titles, and a permanent residence in the upper tiers, and he declined all of them with the same mild patience he had brought to the duel because the thermal regulator he had originally been sent to fix was still tripping, and he had not finished the job, and a job left half done sat wrong with him in a way that no honor could settle. He went back down into the galleries. And on the 3rd day of his return, when he climbed up out of the access hatch at the end of a long shift, he found that someone had left, on the lip of the hatch, a cup of the bitter Tesseran brewing root that the duelists drank before a settlement, steam still rising off it in the cool air of the chamber. There was no note. There was no one waiting to be thanked. He picked it up, and it was warm in his hand, and across the chamber, at the proctor's station where she now stood her own watch, Sevak Lateran did not turn to look at him, which was how he knew she had been the one to leave it. He drank the brewing root. It was bitter and strange, and not made for a human palate, and he finished all of it, and he set the empty cup back on the lip of the hatch, and he went back to work. In the seasons that followed, the proctors of the Spire of Settled Things changed the training of every new initiate, and the change was small and never written down as a rule, but it took hold all the same. They taught the young Tisserand to ask, when faced with a thing they could not move, not how hard they could grip it, but where it wanted to break. They called it, among themselves, reading the fracture. They did not name the human in the lesson. They did not have to. Every proctor who taught it had been in the gallery, or had been taught by someone who was, and they all knew where the lesson came from, the way you know the shape of a thing by the hole it leaves. Ellery Vane fixed the thermal regulator on his 11th day back. He flagged 2 more undocumented conduits in the course of the repair, both of them harmless, both of them logged in proper maintenance notes that were, this time, read and acted upon within the day. He stayed 3 more seasons, and then his contract ended, and he packed his tools and his bent spoon, which he had never replaced, and he prepared to leave the conclave for whatever station needed a contractor next. On the morning of his departure, the proctors of the Spire did a thing that had no precedent in the right and no place in the law, and that they would have been unable to explain if anyone had asked them to. They stood the formation, the settlement formation, the arrangement of proctors that flanked a duelist of the conclave when the matter at hand was one of honor, the formation that no outsider had ever stood in, and no human could ever, by any law of the Spire, be entitled to. They stood it for him as he crossed the chamber toward the doors, 400 of them in their tiers and the proctors below in their line, and Sevak Lateran at the head of the line where she had earned her place. and not one of them said a word, because the thing they were saying could not be said and did not need to be. Ellery Vane walked through the formation with his tools on his shoulder and his spoon in his pocket. He did not stop. He did not make a speech. At the doors of the spire of settled things, he paused for exactly one beat, and he looked back at the line of proctors, at the proctor in training who was no longer in training, and he gave a single short nod. The nod of one working being to another at the end of a long job done right. Then he went out into the trade season morning, and the doors of the spire closed behind him, and the disk in the center of the chamber, which the Tesseract said remembered every duel it had drunk, kept its heat a little longer than usual, the way warmth lingers in a thing that has been held.